Cool. Awesome. Thanks everybody for attending our session today. We're both super excited to be up here and to be sharing some of our research into the Syrian Electronic Army and their mobile surveillance tool that we call SilverHawk. So first off, who are we? My name's Michael Flossman. I head up Lookout's threat intelligence team, and I'm joined on stage by Kristen Del Rosso, who is a security intelligence analyst in the Intel team as well. And we've got the really exciting and interesting job of researching mobile malware and a really interesting subset of that is surveillanceware. So our goal is focused on understanding not only how these tools work, but also who created them, for what purpose, where in the world are they deploying them, what are the attack vectors that they're using, and how successful are they. So in a lot of cases, we'll obviously look into infrastructure and try and identify whether there have been any operational security mistakes made that allow us to get an insight into exfiltrated data that's been stolen from targets of interest. And we kind of use all this information to build out that context. So you might be familiar with some of the families we've reported on in the past, things like Pegasus, ViperRAT, Caracal, StealthMango, Tangelo, and a bunch of other names that probably that might not make any sense unless you're familiar with them. If you're not, check out our blog if mobile surveillanceware is your jam. But for this talk, we're going to be focusing on the Syrian Electronic Army. So we'll kick things off with just a bit of background information into who this group is and how a bit of background information about them basically before shifting to their mobile tool, SilverHawk. We'll then change things up a bit and talk about the attack vectors that this group has used to actually deliver this tool, and not only a mobile component, but also a desktop piece as well as a phishing component. And then throughout this entire talk and the investigative work that we've done, we've come across a number of different personas that we've been able to tie back to the Syrian Electronic Army and actually do attribution. When it comes to actually identifying interesting malware and surveillanceware, there are a number of different ways that we can do this. And one of the ways that we've had a lot of success is by actually focusing on regions of the world where there's a lot of volatility. And what we tend to find is that when we look at our telemetry in places where there's a lot of political conflict and tension and security risks, there are often regional players that are deploying surveillanceware in conjunction with all that volatility to kind of get an edge over their opponents, their neighbors, or domestic people of interest. So with that in mind, like places like China, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, these are all interesting places for us to continually monitor our telemetry and see what's coming up and popping up in those regions. And also the Middle East is unsurprisingly a really interesting place for us as researchers to focus our attention. So over the years in doing this, we've seen things like ViperRAT, which was a targeted mobile, purely mobile campaign that was running for multiple years and was being pretty much deployed purely against the Israeli Defense Force. So what we saw in this case was that members of the military had their devices successfully compromised by the actor running this, and the operator of this campaign was able to get continual updates on things like geolocation coordinates, as well as sensitive information that was on these devices. So pretty successful there. And then if we switch right next door, same sort of thing in Palestine with an actor running a multi-platform campaign against the government there. So deploying malicious desktop binaries, as well as a mobile component, and also phishing certain targets of interest. So these are just two examples of some of the more interesting things that we've looked at in this region, but there are a lot of other actors. Some are financially focused, others are using more sophisticated tools than these two, for example, Pegasus, so NSO's bespoke tool. So it makes sense for us to pay a lot of attention to our data in this part of the world.
Yeah, and so like Michael said, when we were focusing on that part of the world, it kind of made sense that at some point something from Syria might pop up. So Syria has been in a civil war since 2011, and before that, they've had decades of political instability. The current president, Bashar al-Assad, his regime is known to be very digitally oppressive, so shutting the internet off, often coinciding when there's protests, filtering web content, blocking social media. And so kind of in conjunction with the physical fighting, it made sense that to get an edge over the dissidents, there might be a cyber component. And also to give you kind of an idea of the landscape that you're in, they were listed, Syria was listed as enemies of the internet in 2014 by Reporters Without Borders. And then they rank 177th out of 180 countries on the World Press Freedom Index. So this is kind of the landscape that you've been in for the last roughly 10, 20 years now. And then in 2011, that's when the Syrian Electronic Army officially first formed, made their first website. And they're a really interesting group to researchers because they are considered one of the first state-sponsored hacking groups, so sponsored by the Assad regime. And they're known to specifically target those dissidents who are anti-Assad, and that means journalists, human rights organizations, doctors even. And so that's who is working on this mobile malware component. And so to give you a history of some of their previous hacks and what they formerly did, they started with fairly simple website defacements. So here's some samples where they hacked Harvard University's website, UCLA's website. The kind of standard protocol was to post pictures of Bashar and then their logo saying Syrian Electronic Army was here. After website defacements, they then pivoted to Twitter hacks, and a lot of them were mainly successful due to good phishing attempts. And so the Twitter accounts that they hacked ranged from news outlets to large organizations to weather stations or sports teams. But what they typically did and how they were successful was they were able to phish employees who would have the appropriate social media credentials. And this is something that we've seen them continue to do for the past few years now. And it's how they've also been successful, where they typically are able to phish admins of groups that they think their targets might be interested in and post malicious content as an admin to try and reach like a wider range of potential targets.
Yeah, so if we rewind to October 2017, we were looking at our data in this part of the world, and a number of interesting applications stood out to us for several reasons. First of all, when we looked at them on VirusTotal, they had no detections at the time. They definitely looked to be custom surveillanceware, and they didn't appear to be widely deployed. So from what we could tell, are being used in a very targeted fashion. And seeing as that's what we're all about, we decided to dig a little deeper. In addition to that, the applications that we found this family that we called SilverHawk inside of were really representative of what we see from a lot of different actors that are deploying surveillanceware. So typically you'll see things like trojanized or surveillanceware trojanized inside of secure messaging applications, secure connectivity applications, and that was the case here. So it definitely kind of motivated us into pulling this entire thing apart and pulling on all the threads and understanding what exactly was going on here. So we found SilverHawk inside of applications like updates for WhatsApp, Telegram, a number of custom chat applications, as well as an application called Chat Secure Ultimate 2017 that you could buy for just under $1,000, or you could enter an unlock code. And we'll get to that a bit later on, as it's kind of related to further work and further tooling by this group. We also found SilverHawk in things that continue to confuse me as a researcher, a trojanized version of a Flash player update. Not sure how people are still getting convinced into installing that, but attackers are still pushing it out, as well as a trojanized version of Microsoft Word, which sounds pretty terrible to actually try and use on a tiny mobile device. But given all the applications that we've seen SilverHawk in, we can kind of see that the threat actors behind this and the developers really favored trojanizing updates to WhatsApp, Telegram, as well as a system package update. So once we had that initial thread in October, we were really interested in obviously trying to identify as many samples as possible that belong to this family, and then actually conduct analysis around the capabilities, but also take a look at some of the other metadata like the timestamps. And the reason for doing that is timestamps can be pretty helpful in a lot of cases in actually figuring out what time zone a malicious developer is on, which can then feed into attribution later on down the line. In this particular case, that wasn't useful for developer time zones, but looking at the dates of when samples were actually packaged, we don't believe they were modified or tampered with essentially. So once we identified more samples, we could do analysis on just the dates themselves and get a good understanding of when these samples were actually being pushed out into the wilds and when they're being created, and get a better understanding of how this actor was operating. So with that in mind, we can kind of see here that SilverHawk samples first popped up in mid 2016, indicating that this actor had a mobile surveillance capability from it at least that point, if not earlier. We think they were testing samples out at that stage before regularly releasing new updates and versions throughout 2017 all the way up until present.
And so in terms of capabilities and what these applications can do, they might have different icons, but they're all basically the same under the hood and do what you would expect generic surveillanceware to do. They don't use any zero-day exploits, but kind of a few interesting things that we can point out that they do is, remotely recording audio. So if you can imagine the implications for political dissidents who might be in sensitive meetings or the enemy would love to know what they're talking about. If their phone's infected, you can just remotely start recording and stream that audio out. Same with remotely turning the camera on and taking photos, as well as accessing photos, videos, files that are already on the phone. A unique aspect that they put in was a survival counter. So what happens is every time there's a connection to the command and control servers that's successful, it resets to 2. And then every time a connection attempt is made, or if the C2 server is down, it drops down by 1. And then when it finally hits 0, SilverHawk is dormant. And then it gets reset upon rebooting the phone. But this is really good for the threat actor, because a lot of you might know that a typical sign of compromise is if you're just churning through battery life really quickly and they've made sure that their app isn't going to raise suspicions by just eating through the person's phone battery. So yeah, other things you'd expect it to do, it'll hide its icon so you don't know it's on the phone, send out basic device information. And then in terms of a sample communication that we saw to one of the command and control servers, this is a packet capture from one of the earlier samples, but they all kind of operate in the same format where it starts with Hamza packet, you get an integer command, and there's dozens of them that will show on the next page, the data that will be going out, and then a Boolean success if it was successful or not, and then it ends with Hamza delimiter stop. So I don't know if you can see it, but this sample for right here is talking about command number 17, which is the basic device information command. And so it was able to send out the IMEI number, the SIM serial number, if the device is rooted or not, who the carrier is, all that information back. And here's a few more. So 17 was the one we talked about, 34 and 35, starting and stopping that audio recording. Throughout the variations of the malware that we've seen, there haven't been too many variations, but the digit or the command number associated to the certain command might alter. But one thing that we noted going through the variants of this malware over the last few years are the earlier samples they're all very basic, but the earlier samples just had the IP address for the command and control servers just hard-coded in along with the port number. Then about a year and a half ago, they tried to obfuscate the IP address a little bit. So they just removed some digits and you did a simple replacement because they replaced like @ for a certain number. And then some of the most recent samples that we saw, they obfuscated the IP address a little bit more and just wrote some strings backwards, even though they're still in plain text. So it was nothing too complex, but we think this is a good indicator that they've been seeing a lot of success with these tools if they haven't felt the need to drastically overhaul the tool that they're working with, because it's been around for a few years now where there are antivirus products that will pick it up. And so they've only had to make minor changes to be able to keep using it successfully.
Yeah, so if we go back to that particular ChatSecure Ultimate application that I mentioned before, that you could unlock for $1,000, as you can expect, if you put an application like this in front of a reverse engineer, they're naturally not only going to look at the malicious side of things, but also try and crack it. In this case, it's basically a level 0 crack me, so super easy. The activation key is just hiding in there. You can enter it in and it says, all your nets are secured with a smiley face, so you know it's completely legitimate. And that's all nice and good, but what's interesting is that activation code not only unlocks that app, but it also appears in one other sample that doesn't belong to SilverHawk. So things started to get interesting for us at this point. We're like, oh, this is kind of weird. There's a connection to a completely different family, and it turns out that this other family was the commodity surveillance tool called JadeRAT, that if you're not familiar with, it's essentially the same. It's got a lot of the same sort of capabilities as SilverHawk. You can pick it up on various forums. So it's capable of recording audio, collecting text messages, the operator of the tool can actually push out certain binaries and have them run on a device. So a lot of similarities with SilverHawk, but it gave us an initial JadeRAT thread to pull on, and from this we're able to identify a number of JadeRAT samples being used by this actor. So not only had they created their own custom in-house tool, but they'd also started playing around with JadeRAT. So if we jump back and do the same sort of date analysis that we looked at previously, we can see that the JadeRAT development took place in early 2016, and they were pretty heavy there, creating a number of different Trojanized applications before actually moving to doing their own custom development. And what we think has taken place here is that they got a bit of mileage out of using JadeRAT, but this is a really well-researched tool. So there's a lot of coverage from antivirus vendors out there, and it's unlikely that it would stay undetected for long on a compromised device. So while it's likely they got value out of it, it's probably one of the reasons that pushed them to actually creating their own tool, which is SilverHawk. As Kristen mentioned, there was no use of 0 days. So you might be wondering how these guys were actually able to compromise target devices of interest. And this is kind of a technique that we see from a lot of other actors that are towards the lower end of sophistication. We see a lot of watering hole sites and a lot of social engineering taking place. And that was the case with this particular group. So they relied a lot on convincing people of interest to visit one of their many watering hole sites. In this case, we can see one for the Chat Secure Lite application. It's got some convincing legitimate material, but then it's also got some stuff that isn't quite legit, which is, here's a good example, which is how to actually go about installing the Chat Secure app. And you should probably not fall for what they're saying when they say enable device administrator access, because it's going to give this app obviously pretty comprehensive control over your device. And as we started looking at all these different watering holes that this group had spun up, we noticed that there was definitely some poor operational security mistakes on their part. So a lot of open directories, which allowed us to see what they were hosting on their infrastructure. Here we can see a lot of the SilverHawk samples that were compiled in, packaged in mid-2017, along with some desktop binaries. And this provided the initial connection to a lot of their desktop tooling as well. And then looking at other watering hole sites that they had, we can see here pretty much all the JadeRAT samples and the last modified timestamps line up with our analysis from a few slides back, where we saw them really ramping up JadeRAT activity in early 2016. Not only were they doing some mobile malware, they were also creating phishing sites. Like Kristen mentioned, they've gotten a lot of mileage in the past out of compromising administrator accounts for certain groups and kind of leveraging that access to target a wider audience. So we can kind of see that down here on the bottom left, where they've successfully compromised the admin account for the Facebook group Syrian National Democratic Alliance, and then posted malicious binaries that are hosted on Mediafire. So they're kind of branching out and making sure that if they can't actually compromise you via an Android surveillanceware tool, they'll actually try and phish your credentials as well.
Yeah, and so we don't have too much time for this talk to get into the desktop component, but it was there in conjunction. And the way that it primarily spread was through Trojanized Word documents. And the titles of these documents seemed to be attention-grabbing, trying to entice what appeared to be, I guess, primarily military-focused or journalist-focused targets, exchange of prisoners, information about a mortar bombardment or a leak seal system. And then some of the tools that they were using on the desktop side, if you're familiar with them, include JadeRAT, HWorm+, a custom .NET downloader, and Dark Comet. And then on top of that, some of their desktop malware used second stage scripts, and those were available on publicly accessible sites like Pastebin. And so in terms of tying it all together and the information that we've kind of briefly shown you guys today and what we've been looking at for a while and how we were able to attribute it to the Syrian Electronic Army, it was through a lot of things. So debugging symbols from logging statements and Android samples, there was a lot of metadata in Word files, along with open directories, bad OPSEC, and then some interesting C2 domains. Regarding the C2 domains, one that really stood out at first was Bashar al-Assad 1, sea.noip.me. So we think SEA, Syrian Electronic Army. But then regarding PDB file paths, so PDB file paths, we got to them, they contain debugging information, which can give a lot of insight into the developer environment. And so a lot of unique names and handles that we saw were Alosh Hacker, the Pro, Abu Allah, Abu Moaz, Katap, Omar, some other ones. But two ones of interest here are Alosh and the Pro. So Alosh Hacker is a previously stated member of the Syrian Electronic Army that was called out by the European Cyber Army, who is very anti-Assad, anti-Syrian Electronic Army. And he was also previously referenced a few years ago in a Citizen Lab report because he was found also through traces through PDB files to be Trojanizing desktop versions of Siphon, which is an anti-surveillance software. And that was also specifically targeting Syrian dissidents. But then another key member here is the Pro. And the Pro, aka Ahmed Al-Agha, he's currently on the FBI Cyber's most wanted list as a known member of the Syrian Electronic Army, charged for a lot of different things. He was first charged in 2016, but he was recently indicted a few months ago in May 2018, still whereabouts unknown. But one of the charges that was kind of probably one of the best known Syrian Electronic Army hacks was for engaging in a hoax regarding a terrorist attack where they hacked the Associated Press's Twitter account, said there were 2 explosions in the White House and Barack Obama was injured. And that wasn't physical terrorism, but had a lot of monetary effects where the Dow Jones dropped 145 points in 2 minutes and the S&P index dropped for 3 minutes. And that wiped out almost $137 billion of value in it. And then other personas that we've got through metadata and logging statements on the top from like the desktop component, Metocoder, the Pro, Radex, Katop, some unique, interesting usernames here. Radex we've seen also not only on desktop, but in a lot of the mobile source code as well. So he's listed in almost every sample of SilverHawk as kind of involved in its development.
Yeah, so with the personas, we can see that some of these hacker handles and individuals have known connections already to the SEA, and others are newcomers to the scene that appear not only in the desktop side of things, but also on the Android, in the Android piece as well as on watering holes. So at the top, Alosh Hacker and the Pro, they already have that connection, and then these guys down the bottom, for the most part, are spread between all the different tooling that is being used by this group. And then there are a few others that we're continuing to dig into, basically. So we haven't been the only people or the only researchers that have been looking at this tool, both on the Android and desktop side. So if you're interested in this, I strongly recommend checking out 360 the threat intelligence write-up. They've got some pretty good stuff there, as well as Kaspersky Labs, FireEye, EFF, and Citizen Lab have looked at either this tooling or the SEA. So just quickly, some of the key takeaways from this talk. We've seen that the SEA, while they've been known to conduct lower sophistication attacks in the past that have predominantly just been phishing, we've seen that they've expanded that out to not only include custom desktop tools as well as commodity desktop tools, but also the same sort of thing on the mobile side of things. So they're continuing to use multi-platform tools as well as create their own stuff. And as we just saw, there are a number of new personas now connected to this group. And at a higher level, it just really shows that there's a low barrier to entry when it comes to creating offensive mobile tooling. We do see some people definitely using premium tools that cost a lot more. But on the flip side, there are a much greater number of actors deploying low sophistication tools and having a lot of success without having to rely on investing in 0 days. It's quite easy to just create a lot of this stuff using publicly available code. So if you'd like to follow us on Twitter.
There's Twitter. Terminal Riff for Flossman, my name, because I'm boring, Kristen Del Rosso. And we're almost out of time, but we'll be up here, or we could quickly answer questions if anyone is interested. So that's this.
Any questions? Yeah.
All right,
So, okay, I will just repeat the question from the beginning for everyone. So you said this unlockable tool they had on their website for $999, it had the difficulty of a level 0 crack me. And I was wondering how about the Trojan you just showed? Is this somehow obfuscated? Is this runtime packed, or was it just like plain AndroidRAT to look at?
As in, how did we get the code, or?
How difficult was it to get the code?
Quite straightforward. So there are a number of tools that you could use to get this information quite easily. Some of them are free, others aren't. So Jab would be like a paid version that's a really good Android reverse engineering tool. But there are a number of other like fairly accessible tools. So like APK tool, or you could just unzip it and look at the smiley as well. So yeah.
Hey, I have a question. Have you seen a SilverHawk variation of this tool infecting IoT devices?
We just got the timeline, but we can answer that up here. I'm sorry, but we can answer that again up here if that's okay, when everyone, I guess, officially stops the recording. Because it's time. Our time's up.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, just come up to the stage, and I'm not sure who asked that, but yeah.
Cool.